So let's jump in. We are on part 7 now, which is entitled Sorrow Increased with Knowledge. Before we jump into the text here, let's remember, right, that this is called an embedded narrative. Embedded narrative. And so where are we at in the narrative is that we had Walton sharing the story, and then we have Frankenstein, Victor. And now we have the creature, the monster. So in the story, the creature is telling Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is recounting this to Walton. So it's all embedded into itself. And so right, we're getting a perspective now of the creature that we didn't have. Up until this point, we had to assume a lot about who the creature is. And then all of a sudden we realized that the creature had a voice. But we have to ask ourselves the question, and I think Andy alluded to this a minute ago, of what's really going on. What is the author doing? Because we have this really stark picture painted for who the creature is. And when the creature begins to give voice to his experience, things have to shift in our perspective. And so one thing that we need to talk about, though, is we need to come to grips with the reality that the creature here has learned. But what has he learned, and how has he learned? And so before we get too much into the text itself, I want to talk to you about, this looks like a pyramid, but it's meant to be more like a cone, if you can imagine it being conical, right? So there you get the... And so it's called the cone of learning. And so this is how, generally speaking, how we learn. 10%, and this is based on after 2 weeks. So I could do a quiz right now of what we talked about 2 weeks ago, and I could indicate to you basically how you came to grasp or understand based on certain factors, which I'll get to. The first of which is 10%. We retain 10% after 2 weeks of what we read. So this is why we read books like this, and we've probably already forgotten a good majority of the book. Why? Because merely reading something alone does not translate to a bunch of knowledge. That seems pretty weird, doesn't it? That knowledge is not primarily grasped in a human person merely by reading something. In fact, just reading something has limitations. So if we want a better way to go about things, 20%, does anyone want to guess? 20% retention in things we hear. All right. But so now we're building, though. So you guys are reading something, right? Tangibly reading this book, and you're going to get some comprehension, some retention from that. But then I'm sharing, or hopefully you're sharing with one of your hearing things. And so hopefully that's going to give you a different glance at it. It might be a different perspective. But now we're building into something, because hearing requires what? Somebody else to verbalize, right? And so now we're building on what is not alluded to here, which we should know, is that your relational quotient, your relational quotient, instead of your IQ, your intellectual quotient, is vastly more important. The relationships in which you have with one another, as far as learning and growing in maturity, is of way more value to you than merely reading something or just hearing something. Let's say online, let's say you watch a YouTube video or you listen to a whatever. The dynamics of somebody who is in relationship with you, right, talking to you, it increases, right? And so we go from 10% reading to 20% hearing, and then we have 30% is what we see. And so now what we're really talking about is observation. And this is why as kids growing up, what you learn and what we see from the monster here, how he learned more so than just reading or hearing, is observational, right? And in fact, this is built into our cultural understanding. Primarily, one of the things that you guys should be orienting your lives around as it pertains to your parents or other adults in the group is observational stance. It's looking around and saying, okay, how are they going about that? Or or when this thing is talking about how do they orient their lives. It might be observational just from standing back and looking. It might be observational by going and asking questions and seeing how it works. And so again, we're building now, right? Reading, hearing, seeing. All right, 50% now is when we begin to build things together. It's what we see and hear, right? And so this is where I already alluded to. Relationship becomes important. Right? We're now really beginning to build a premise of learning that's built on a dynamic of other people. Right? Because I can read by myself and I can even hear because we have technology. I can hear by myself and I can see things by myself. But seeing and hearing now kind of takes it to a different level of relational nature of things. When we go from there, 70%. This is really interesting, I think. You might be bored to tears with it. 70% things that we say. Now, why is this significant? Because again, when we say things, we're doing it to whom? It's not just by saying it out loud, although that's part of it, but it's saying things relationally, right? It's conversation. It's where when I highlight questions or say to consider talking to your parents about it, it is giving you the context to learn and grow. Because what you're doing is you're processing your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, and you begin to put that verbally. And what that does is it begins to build a structure in your life where things begin to be attached, right? So things that I am talking about, I can remember. Things I'm engaging with other people in conversation, right? Words coming out of my mouth, which is what? Is a creative process. When God created the heavens and the earth, right? He spoke things into existence. So it doesn't surprise us then that speaking carries with it a great amount of learning, and there's kind of a cultural understanding now. But the thing that primarily, more than anything, it's not just saying. It's what you do. It's what you do that matters. You see, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, it matters little what you know. It matters greatly in how you orient your life. And so, in fact, right, we all know this to be true. You can look at the way somebody lives their life, and you can have an understanding of what they value. Right? If you see somebody who pursues time with the Lord, who pursues conversation, who pursues relationship, you would say that person is more relational in nature. Right? If you saw somebody who did nothing but spend time on video games, what does that say is the priority of their life? Is that video game, right? And so ultimately, though, we learn through the concept of relationship, because what we do in this world requires others, right? Right? When we learn to love, we have to have somebody to receive from and give to, right? I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about here with the creature is why does he come to this point where he's verbal, where he has have alluded that he has some emotions, some thoughts on things? Because there had to be experience that he was walking out. Now, we see this demonstrated through the lens of a family. And really what the family offers for us is an idealized sense for the creature of what culture should look like, right? He comes from the context of his creator, who should be his father, and is that a healthy relationship or a fractured one? Fractured, yeah, like really clearly fractured right away. And so he doesn't have context, right, for any real healthy dynamic between a family up until he observes this family and he sees something that to him would have been foreign. What does he see? Does he see healthy relationships? Does he see mutual respect? Does he see family affection? Does he see a building up, right? Now this is, again, this is a whole different way of life for him. and what we begin to see in his life, because he is observing and hearing, right? In the context of relationship, he's allowed to mature. Now again, I can promise you Mary Shelley didn't sit down and say, let me think of the cone of learning and what I really want to communicate. But these are universal truths. What we see and hear, what we observe, what we pay attention to, what we surround ourselves with, right? Because this is really, the seeing and hearing is really how we orient our lives and position ourselves around other people. If we're willing to see what other people are doing, hear what other people are saying, if we're able to at least start at that point, right, we're able to build a really good foundation. But we then have a responsibility back to do what? To engage in saying and doing. What does the monster not have occur in his life? Really?
No connection.
What's that?
No connection.
No connection, right? He doesn't understand the give and take. He wants to, right? You see that in his heart, like he desires, like if only I could get in there, but I can't.
Scared to death.
Right. And why is he scared? Yes. And why is he scared to engage in relationship?
Bad experience.
Yeah.
He's been hurt before.
His only experience with humanity is his creator. And his creator does what? Abandons him and rejects him. Yeah, it's trying to kill him for sure. And so that does not orient a person's life towards anything that's healthy. We talked about last week, or I had you ask the question, why are relationships so important? Why are they so valuable? And I think we all know that intuitively. Like, you know, right, that it is better. The Bible says it, right? It's not good for man to be alone. But you know that. Even if you didn't have the Bible. Like, take a biblical worldview out of it. If you're even in the world, you know that there's a desire within your heart for connection. All humankind has it. Regardless of what religion you're born around, no matter what cultural context, there is an innate desire to connect with others. Relationships are important because relationships give us context for the greater world around us. See, again, biblically, we know this. It's not good for man to be alone. But in the reality of the world, right, we need others. And we need others in a way to hear what they have to say, to see what they're doing. But we also, right, and Walton kind of hints at this in his letters, we also have a real desire to be seen, to be heard, to be known. And so we can go about that one of two ways, right? We can do it in a healthy way, try to do the right things to be observed, or we can do it in an unhealthy way, act out. There's positive attention seeking, negative attention seeking, right? It's not bad though for us to want to be seen, want to be affirmed, want to be validated. That's not a bad thing. It can become a bad thing when it's so self-absorbing that it's just about me. But no, it's never a bad thing to want somebody to see that you did a good job, to recognize it. And so we see here in these chapters kind of this coming to this understanding of how does the monster get to a place where he's at least semi-functional. Because what we see is, she offers us is a character, I don't know, maybe you don't, but don't you want to kind of like him? Don't you want to for the monster to get what he wants, which is relationship? Don't you feel for the monster somehow that man, if only you could experience human touch, human connection, where you're not being visibly put aside because of the way that you look. Right? Because let's be honest, he looks horrific to the human eye. And again, let's explore the implication here, because we all have a responsibility to observe the world around us and to treat people not the way that we think they should be treated, and certainly not based solely upon how they look or our own judgments. Right? But we should, as followers of the way, as sons of God, should observe a world in which we what? We recognize the divine life given to all humanity. And this is a tricky thing because, again, what Frankenstein is getting at is really about our morality. Are we a moral people? And again, juxtaposing particularly the father, right, in the household versus Frankenstein, we see kind of polar opposites, right? How does the father act towards the children in the house? Love, affection, belonging, care, concern, provision. Now, what do we see take place within the heart of the creature? He begins to do things for the family, right? He observes the need, and he begins to, in his own way, engage in a place that is safe, right? It's always out of sight. It's certainly out of mind. He doesn't want to be around them. He doesn't want them to witness him. But he sees the value of his contribution to the family. In some ways, he's adopted this family as his very own. And what is he doing? He's building up towards the opportunity to engage with them. Yeah? And so we see that really ultimately here, it's kind of continuing this theme of accountability versus responsibility. And what we see in the life, reflected at least in the life of the creature here, is that he's much more willing to take some level of accountability for his life and some responsibility for others. He's somewhat limited in how he can pursue that, right? And yet what we see ultimately is this theme really of how sorrow is increased by knowledge. Because one of the drawbacks that we see with relational quotient, with relational understanding or orienting your life around relational dynamics is that when you don't have healthy, structured relationships and you go from a place of lack to a place now of desire and something healthy, that brings the monster here to a place of grief, brokenness. Why? Because it's a thing he doesn't think he can ever fully grasp. He knows now what it's like to be in a family. He knows what healthy relationship dynamics could be, and yet he's always on the outside looking in. He's always footsteps away. He's never fully able to take that last step. He's still hindered in many ways by the image that his creator has given him. Now, I think Mary Shelley, in this light, is very, very intentional in this thing. Because what we see is that the monster's life as well is at a crossroads. And where Victor has been afforded a beautiful childhood, a fantastic upbringing, and he has thrown off the relational understanding of life and pursued knowledge, we now see that play out in the life of the creature who had no context for relationships but is learning. He's learning through observation. And yet, because of the way he looks, his physical stature, he doesn't quite fit into society, does he? He's still an outcast. And so at the end of the day, isn't the monster kind of set up to fail here in many ways? Mm-hmm. Which is, to me, is the most heartbreaking part of this book. Certainly heartbreaking that people have met the ultimate fate, right? Death. But we see in the life of the creature a sympathetic character. Right? Because death for this creature is not in his physical body dying. There is an emotional death that occurs again and again and again through rejection. Now, why is this significant? Because whether we know it or not, we have a tremendous opportunity in the way that we relate to one another to either bring life and validation, or intentionally or otherwise, to push other people and to reject. And if we're not careful, even in our own hearts, we can set ourselves up to fail, right? We can have the mindset, and the monster certainly develops or has cultivated this mindset. They could never really love me because if they ever really knew who I am, then they would have this response. And so this is kind of a self-fulfilled prophecy for him. But we, if we're honest with ourselves, if we look in our own hearts and we already assume things about ourselves, and these could be, it could be shortcomings, it could be the way that we look, it could be maybe we don't understand things the way that they understand, and we begin to live our lives based on other people's impressions of us. Instead of really seeing and hearing what is the most significant relationship in which that we see, we observe, we hear? That's, again, the context of the relationship, creator to creation, is so important. The Bible says this now, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans 10:17. What we hear from the Lord, certainly how we engage Scripture, but what we hear, how the Spirit moves in our life. Are we looking at the landscape of our spiritual life and observing what God is doing in and through our lives? Are we being mindful of it? And then, right, the creator and creature relationship is not just solely designed to be just that dynamic, right? God has given us one another. And so now we take shape to our relationships and how they're not supposed to just be reflected upwards towards God, but they're supposed to be reflected outwards towards one another. And so we carry within us, right, the potential to affirm the truth of who God is by doing what? Loving, respecting, encouraging, building one another up. Or we can fall short of that standard, right? And this is where hurt and rejection and pain can enter into the equation. Right? Let's all be honest. On our worst days, we don't often or always reflect the love of God as we ought to. Is that fair to say? Is it fair to say that you and I have acted out of ignorance, or we've acted out of a wrong mindset as it pertains to one another? Now, again, we look at the creature, right? We look at the creature and we see a life that has not been cultivated in the right way. But we see what the creature has right at his fingertips is an opportunity at a different culture. If only those affections could be reciprocated. So let's take a look here in the book, and we're going to skip over a good part of it for the sake of time, and also because I think we kind of get the point, right? And so first in chapter 4, we see this longing and this observation that the creature takes. It says, I lay on my straw, but I could not sleep. I thought of the occurrences of the day. What chiefly struck me was the gentle manner of these people, and I longed to join them, but dared not. Has anyone ever felt that way? Have you ever experienced it? You have such a desire to join in, but you just feel limited. Like, I couldn't really do that. Now, my hope is, for all of us, is that we don't stop short here. God gives us a longing, hopefully the longing for the right things, right? Now, this is a family culture that is a healthy one. And so what we're not saying is, whatever you long for, pursue. That's not the lesson here. He sees that they're gentle manners, right? There's something about these people that he wants to move towards. In fact, he says the young man was constantly employed out of doors, and the girl in various laborious occupations within. And so now he's just seeing there's kind of a way that they orient their life, not just for the sake of themselves, but for others. Like even the monster can begin to compartmentalize like the value of family and how each one plays a part or a role. Nothing could exceed the love and respect which the younger cottagers exhibited towards their venerable companion. They performed towards him every little office of affection and duty with gentleness, and he rewarded them by his benevolent smiles. Now again, this is a proper context of familial relationships, right? These kids don't demonstrate I have to. There is an affection that they have here that is oriented around what? Sacrifice and service. Love, honor, respect. Not demanded, but rewarded with what? Smiles, relationship. Right? What these kids had to get, to receive, was the relational context. And see, again, the monster is observing this. This is the way things should be, right? Our culture teaches an environment where you should question your parents. You should push away from what they're doing. You should be your own person. That's such garbage. It's just terrible, horrible garbage. And we can, even now, we can make yeah, we agree that's garbage. The real question is what are we going to do with the knowledge we have relationally? What are you going to do? The observation, the opportunity that you have to observe a healthy household in your own homes with your parents, and that looks like, right? Obedient sonship. Which means, right, if your parents are saying, this is what I think you should do, how should we follow suit? And for some of us, maybe even as I say that, you're going, yeah, no, but there's a resistance in my heart here, because maybe I don't like what mom and dad always say. I was a teenager once. I remember the struggle. It's not always as easy, is it? Sometimes we have bad attitudes, wrong mindsets. And yet we have to trust, right, that the one whom the Lord has placed in our life is placed there for a purpose. And we have to trust that the person that God has placed in our life is also maturing and growing. And what we at a minimum have to do is understand that they're always willing to have conversation with me. Now, it may not be the conversation you want to have. And it may not be the answer you want to get. But the relationship is central, right? And this is the observation the monster is making. He has, by the way, more maturity here than Victor. He understands that it was what is of greatest value is relationship. And he mourns the fact that he cannot experience it. Page 123. Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant. But I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endured with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even the same nature as man. And is that true? Not even the same nature as... See, the monster here is bought into the lie. But it's a lie that his creator communicated to him poorly. We're on page 123 here. I was more agile than they and could subsist upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. And so what is the monster communicating here? It would have been better that if I just focused on those basic things. Food to eat, water to drink, warmth. But I set my sights and my heart towards something greater. Relationship. if a fictional character in a book, from a secular perspective, can get this fundamentally, how much more so should we wrap our hearts around the purpose of your life, the purpose of us being here in this room is not knowledge. It's relationship. It's what we have to offer one another. It's love and affection and encouragement. It's the person who looks at you when you've harmed them and says, I forgive you. It's the person who when you falter, comes to help pick you up. It's the person who, when you don't believe in yourself, believes in you and encourages you and empowers you to break past the limitations you've set on yourself. You see, the monster here is a really good tool for us to have insight into the human heart. In fact, he says he doesn't have the same nature as a man, but I tell you, that very nature that's built in him for relationship is exactly what makes you human. All animals develop relationships, but only man has the ability to communicate on a level that goes beyond the natural realm. Of what strange nature is knowledge? It clings to the mind when it has once seized on it, like a lichen on a rock. I wish sometimes to shake off all thought and feeling, but I learned that there was but one means to overcome the sensation of pain, and that was death, a state which I feared yet did not understand. I admired virtue and good feelings and loved the gentle manners and amiable qualities of my cottagers, but I was shut out from intercourse with them, except through means which I obtained by stealth when I was unseen and unknown, and which rather increased than satisfied the desire I had of becoming one among my fellows. Again, we see the increased desire here for relationship. But what happens when that is not met with reciprocation? There can only be one end to that. Listen, I'm here to tell you as one who has tasted the bitterness of rejection at people, parents, particularly a father figure in my life. I can tell you exactly what that feels like. And there's no way I can describe it. I can give you words to help you comprehend it. And you can experience it maybe in a small part, in the ways that maybe some of your parents have hurt you. But I tell you, there's a vast difference between being told no and being told get out. What we're talking about here in the culture in which you are brought up is that there is no context for a mindset, particularly with a father, your Father in heaven, who says get out, who has cast you down, who has set you aside, no matter how you see your life. The Lord is very desirous to get to know you and to be known by you. His heart is for you. In fact, He's trying to, in your life even now, to give you all of not just the tools, but all of the cultural understanding, the relational knowledge, and the ability to fully mature, to grow, to understand, so that you can be fully equipped to do what? To engage in relationship with one another. One of you said earlier in your biography that man, this person came out of a really rough childhood and they made something of themselves. That is a pretty distinct and unique. That's not always the case. But how much more so should we as a people who really truly discern and understand the heart of God, how much more so as we as people should learn to relate to one another, to really be mindful of the kinds of relationships that we cultivate with one another, of how we prioritize one another. Not as we wish, but as the Spirit of God leads us, right? Because we're not just natural fleshly people. Our lives are oriented in a different way. And so when we look at the monster, we can see reflections of a life that has so much potential. But it's lacking the most important thing: relationship. You take relationship out of the equation, and it leads to ruin. The moment you take your relationship with God for granted, right, it becomes familiar, that undermines things. The moment you take your parents for granted, you treat them as familiar, right? We talk about this, the familiar spirit. What does it do? It undermines the proper context for relationship. You see, the enemy of your soul is trying to get you to think that it's what you think, and it's what you feel, and it's what you want, it's what you desire, and it's not, right? We know this. How is the Lord leading us by his Spirit? At the very closing of that same chapter here, he says, "But where were my friends and relations? No father had watched my infant days. No mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses. Or if they had, all my past life was now a blot, a blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing. From my earliest remembrance, I had been as I then was in height and proportion. I had never yet seen a being resembling me, or who claimed any intercourse with me. What was I?" The question again recurred, to be answered only with groans. What was I? You see, the monster is searching for an identity and a purpose, which can only be given and bestowed by the Father. And yet you and I don't have that same struggle. We may feel like we have that struggle, and that's okay. But the truth is that you and I have been very clearly given the Father's heart. Right? We have been planted with the seed of sonship. And that changes things. And so as we continue to read this book, in fact, we're going to read 2 more chapters this week. Let's keep this in mind again, these relational dynamics and why they're so significant to you and I. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why the Lord brought us to this book. I know this is a hard read in these places. They're heartbreaking to experience this. But this is really a good reflection for us to consider lives that have no relational context. What happens to a man or a monster who doesn't have the context of actual relationship? There is only one end. In fact, ultimately, they use a very specific kind of the destruction, meaning knowledge. This is why sorrow increases with knowledge, right? The whole idea of the concept of knowledge being pursued as being destructive is purposeful, I think, from the Lord's perspective. The Bible says this: knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Knowledge is a singular pursuit. You can pursue knowledge apart from any relationship. You can gain knowledge without any relational context. You cannot gain love apart from relationship. It is the only place in which you can find it is in another. And the world has deceived a great many people into thinking that well, you can love yourself. That's foolish. Because the way that you love yourself will never measure up, because you are made, designed in God's image. And if you are designed and created in God's image, and God was Father, Son, and Spirit for all eternity before you, then part of that image means that we must be in relationship. So I want to invite you guys into thinking beyond just why are relationships important. I want you to really begin to consider, what does it even mean? What does that even mean to be in relationship with someone? Because it goes beyond just, well, I spend time with them, I hang out with them. Right? Is the relationships God has given you mutual? I want to ask you, reflect upon this. In some of your relationships, are you giving more than you're taking? Are you taking more than you're giving? Now, I don't think that any relationship it's not always 50-50. I think that's a foolish mindset. Again, the best analogy I can give is in the context of marriage with Nicole. I'm sure Andy would agree with this with Leda. There are times where I need to provide much more of the relationship dynamic because my wife might be going through something. So I have to hold the weight and the responsibility at a much higher level. And then there's times where I'm down and hurting. And what I need is for Nicole to rise up and hold the weight. And so sometimes it's 40-60, and sometimes it's 80-20, and sometimes it's 50-50. But the equation is always what? That both people add up to 100%. And that's true of the context of any relationship. When you were younger, right? Camden needs much more of my energy on certain things. But he doesn't need certain things like Caden needs, right? Because the relationship is different. And so I have to constantly consider what are those dynamics. And so I want to invite you guys into being mindful and prayerful about how do I engage? What does the relationship look like? Maybe if you reflect on it and say, man, I'm giving a lot to that relationship. It could be one of two things could be happening. It could be because you're hogging the time and you're not giving that other person an opportunity to step into that relationship. Or it could be a sign that the Lord has placed you in a relationship where that other person is growing and holding the weight. We have to ask ourselves those questions. What is not happening though is like, well, I'm giving too much, so I'm just going to shut that down. Like, you've got to be really, really clear that the Lord is shutting down the context of relationships. You've got to be really discerning in that. Because what I can promise you, at least here, is there's not a single relationship in this room that the Lord has shut down. You guys we're in it together. Now that doesn't mean that we're all, best friends and hanging out all the time. Because there's times and seasons, right? But let's discern those times and seasons. Why? Because it's not good for any of us to be alone. And being alone doesn't just mean you have friends around, because you can have a great many people around you and still feel alone. The monster is a good example of that. He felt alone and he did nothing to remedy his situation. And so in this area, he is fully responsible. He knows what he should do. He's not acting on it. For some of us, we know what we should do. And maybe the time and the season has come for us to consider the nature of the relationships God has given us and to begin to do. Because maybe some of us are saying, yeah, we really want to learn, and we haven't come to a full understanding. And the reason for that likely is you're not putting it into practice. It's still residing in your mind. And what will be true is if you keep things in your mind, only sorrow can increase from that. Because knowledge will bring sorrow. And it looks like, man, if only I could just have this, or it's the struggle that you go through in your mind. And so this week, we will read chapters 6 and 7. And I want you to ask this question and flesh it out a little bit more. Why did God say in Genesis that it isn't good for man to be alone? We talked about it a little bit, but I want you to explore that a little bit more. The implications of that, because I think it's pretty far-reaching. And then we're going to read Volume 2, chapters 6 and 7. That is it. Thank you all.
Thank you, Justin.